Well, it's time now for a deep dive interview with Mike Benz. Mike Benz joins us now as a former State Department official, founder and executive director of the Foundation for Freedom Online. Mike, great to have you here on the show. We've been trying to get you on, I think, for, a couple of years now. And finally, our schedules aligned. I know you're a busy man. Great to see you. Welcome to the show. Great to see you. Thanks for having me. Well, I want to get your take first on this. There's a lot to cover today, but something happened this weekend in Denver, Colorado. You might have heard about this, quote, massive grassroots rally with AOC, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders tweeted this. The video speaks for itself. 34,000 people out in Denver, largest political rally there since 2008. The message is clear. No authoritarianism, no to oligarchy, no to Trumpism. We're ready to fight back. And so here was the rally. Here's like an aerial video of the rally. But according to data and according to Tony Saruja and Zero Hedge, the real number was closer to 20,000. But even beyond that, when you look at GPS and cell phone data, a whopping 84% of those same devices showed up at 9 or more of these protest or rallies, including Antifa, Black Lives Matter events, like pro-Hamas events, demonstrations, Kamala Harris campaign stops. So it all seems really fishy to me. I know you've been looking at this data. First, just on this fake crowd question, are these legitimate crowds that are showing up here?
I don't know. There's a lot of information that's traded kind of speculatively about these things, because unless you have a smoking gun confession, it's hard to fully nail it down, or unless you have organizational documents that leak or something like that. At the same time, we know that this is a network that is fond, if of anything in this world, of these astroturfed, pro-democracy wellsprings, this sort of emphasis on being in the streets and having a physical show of force in order to effectively preempt the perception that you get from polling data about what everybody else in the country thinks. If it looks like people are on the streets, then people think, oh, this is what the people want. This was the strategy of the U.S. State Department during the Arab Spring. This was the strategy of the U.S. State Department in Romania. This was the strategy of the U.S. State Department in Cuba. Basically, if 60% of the population wants one thing, if you just get 40,000 people in the streets saying the other, and they're loud and they're occupying central territory, then you can make the argument, the government is repressing the will of the people, even though, the people are voting for the opposite thing than the people are protesting about, but they're loud and they're in front of the cameras, so they saturate footage. So I don't know if that's going on here. Certainly we see astroturfing in the form of these groups like Indivisible, which is, one of these George Soros funded, Reid Hoffman funded, Rent a Riot monstrosities. They played a big role in the riots and protests involved in the 2020 election cycle. They had something, I believe it was called Hold the Line, Them and Move On, and Stand Up. These things are always some flowery way of saying, get in their face in the streets.
Right.
And it's always attached with this kind of clenched fist sort of, mentality or messaging that's intended to sort of softly terrorize people without coming out and straight up saying, we're going to punch you in the face. They just put the clenched fist in your face. Everything from, the Black Lives Matter folks to the Otpor movement in Serbia, which got something like $70 million from the CIA, to the Canvas movement. And, from the Arab Spring onwards, they loved that kind of in the streets, in your face, with a clenched fist sort of thing. And we see that now playing out, of course, with the terrorism against Tesla.
Yeah, right. Soft terrorism. I've never heard that before, but that's good. Yeah.
I have a question for you. Since you focus a lot on cybersecurity and cyber ops and PsyOps, specifically through the U.S. government, this weekend, the Epoch Times reported that the drug cartels are using the Israeli spyware Pegasus to fight the drug war inside the United States. Now, Nicole Perlroth, the woman who broke the Edward Snowden documents for the New York Times, she interviewed the founders of this software, and they told her that every time they sell this software, the Israeli Ministry of Defense has to approve the sale, which means that Israel gets to decide who gets spied on and who isn't. Now, if Israel is supposedly, the company line is our greatest ally, would they have approved software to spy on us, the Americans? And do you expect that the Trump administration would ever push back and say, hey, wait a minute, did you approve this? Can you look into how this is getting used in our drug war against the cartel? What is your assessment of that?
Well, it's complicated because I doubt that the Israeli government would do that without the approval of relevant folks at the Pentagon or U.S. intelligence. It's unclear who would be the senior versus junior partner in that U.S.-Israeli setup. The fact is most of U.S. intelligence, when we do spycraft work, it runs through cyber systems from Unit 8200 or from the Israeli tech and surveillance sphere. And you don't know if you have these sort of Colombian or Mexican narco cartels, if they are, for example, using Israeli spy tech, if they're also operating to some extent with oversight, guidance, funding, support, or direction from U.S. intelligence. There's a very, very dark history around the role of drug gangs.
Why? Why would we help them do that to us?
Well, this is sort of a long story, but I don't know how much detail you want me to get into on this. But the U.S. intelligence and military has been working with drug gangs for coming up on a full century now. This started in East Asia. You had the Opium Wars with the British against China when China in the 1800s refused to import British opium. That then led to the British seizure of Hong Kong, the bombing of Southeast China, the century of humiliation that lasted up until the rise of Mao. At that point, the U.S. government, before we even had a CIA, the U.S. Department of War, was funding the Chinese nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang against Mao. Could not get enough money for that war from congressional allocations, and so the U.S. military supported that war through narco trafficking. They took the opium that was being grown in the Golden Triangle, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, flew it out on U.S. military aircraft, converted the drugs to cash for guns. We see that same operation played out in the 1970s and 80s with the Mujahideen, when the CIA set up BCCI, Bank of Credit and Commerce International, and turned the Golden Crescent into the narco kingpin territory of planet Earth. It was used, these heroin proceeds were used to fund the Mujahideen and another drugs for cash for guns operation, laundered through these CIA banks in Pakistan and with assistance out into Turkey and Italy. In terms of moving those drugs, of course, the Taliban banned the poppy production in the year 2000. We then promptly invaded Afghanistan shortly after 9/11, and then ended up under U.S. military occupation. Afghanistan then went from 0% of the world's heroin to 95% of the world's heroin. When the Taliban just took back over in 2022, the U.S. Institute of Peace, which just had its doors kicked down by federal police after they refused to allow Trump-appointed board members into the building and broke their own doors so that to stop Trump officials from getting into the building, the U.S. Institute of Peace, which gets almost $60 million a year of State Department funds, it's parked right next to the State Department. I used to walk right by it. They published a piece just a year and a half ago under the Biden administration, calling on the Taliban to let the drugs flow again in Afghanistan because their attempt to shut down poppy after they took back over in Afghanistan was going to cause negative economic and humanitarian crises. But then the same thing happened in the Western Hemisphere. During the time of the rise of left-wing Marxist groups in Latin and South America and the Caribbean, there was a rising tide of left-wing Marxist liberation theology. And part of the response of that from the Department of War and the Central Intelligence Agency was to essentially fund these narco networks that were used at the time as right-wing death squads in El Salvador and drug mules and money launderers and paramilitaries for hire in Colombia and in Mexico and in Peru and Bolivia. And we saw the presence of these narco gangs and support for CIA-backed candidates like like Juan Guaido in Venezuela. The fact is these narco networks serve as paramilitary muscle for U.S. statecraft in the Western Hemisphere, the same way they did with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the same way they did with the Kuomintang in China. And so, when I hear the story about these, narco networks using Israeli spycraft technology, I have no doubt that they do. So does U.S. intelligence, and the linkage between U.S. intelligence and the narco networks, I think, is something that many Americans don't want to look, stare into the sun and see how bright the glare is.
Right.
Well,
and
also,
in fact, if I may just, there's a USAID link to this as well, because Alfred McCoy in his book talks about how the CIA used USAID to bribe these towns to sell them drugs in exchange for rice, and they wouldn't get it if they didn't produce. So is there then some kind of tit for tat like that happening in South America right now to allow drugs to come into the United States?
Well, not only that, as Alfred McCoy documented and then testified about in 1972, the USAID actually bought 2 CIA proprietary aircraft for the CIA mercenary army in Cambodia and Laos. They bought 2 CIA aircraft from Air America and Continental Air Services, which obviously are CIA proprietaries, as we now know. It was not known at the time. And that's what allowed them to transport the drugs from Cambodia into Vietnam in order to sell them retail onto the market. They were actually, so USAID paid for them to buy CIA airlines. I mean, but this again, that was in 1967 when they were doing that. It was just 5 years after USAID was created. And USAID, of course, is all over these drug networks. USAID was caught spending hundreds of millions of dollars irrigating all of the heroin, the poppy fields in Afghanistan. USAID, it's hard to squint and look for a drug network in this world that USAID is not directly or indirectly capacity building and providing financial support to. But this gets to that sort of ugly picture about the role of drug money in proxy wars. You see, we have a big problem, which is that Congress can only allocate so much money on foreign assistance. I've sometimes joked that the more money you take out of USAID, the more drugs that certain rogue networks in the U.S. military and intelligence spheres will feel the need to launder, because the whole reason you set up this black market for buying and selling drugs is because it's the same reason. Now, drugs are not unique in this way. Diamonds and precious metals. Basically, when you're trying to fund a plausibly deniable mercenary army in some remote conflict zone, what you want is a cash business where you have small items worth a lot of cash. Because small items can be easily smuggled, they can be hidden inside of fruit, or they can be hidden inside of human orifices. They can be very hard to detect, and a truck full of it can fund an army for months. A truck full of cocaine, a truck full of opium, a truck full of diamonds or precious metals is worth its weight in gold, so to speak. And so this has been going on now for a century. The issue is who's going to take this on, given that 30% of American prosecutors now are Soros prosecutors. And as I've long said, Soros is the long arm of the State Department, the long arm of NATO and the U.S. military and intelligence. It's the civil society frontman for the machinations of the blob. And when you have these prosecutor groups who are not deliberately not going after the drug networks, you see this time and time again. They're basically letting them off in Chicago, in L.A., in New York, in Boston, in Arizona. The Arizona case is especially egregious with what's going on there, given that Arizona is Sinaloa cartel territory. It's basically the CIA, cartel par excellence, right over the border. And then you have all these shenanigans to stop Kari Lake from taking the helms of the executive branch. You have all these allegations of cartel influence over the judiciary. You have basically the green lighting of all these activities, since it comes in from Arizona and then it goes to Chicago and to the rest of the country from there. And of course, Arizona was the site of where we funded the drug cartels and gave them arms just a decade ago during Operation Fast and Furious, when there was an FBI, ATF, interagency approved, meaning approved by the National Security Council, the State Department, the CIA, the DOD, to run guns directly to the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico over the Arizona border so that they could fight a war with another narco cartel called the Zetas, who had been pilfering U.S. oil from pipelines in Mexico. We couldn't go in and just bomb a sovereign country's citizens, so we pumped up our own paramilitary drug gang to fight another paramilitary drug gang. Of course, the Zetas got their origins being trained by the U.S. Army in the first place, but you can see what a tangled web it is.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, because you talked about, well, we were talking about Israel and Pegasus and the backdoor mechanisms that they can use to take over a phone. We also, I've seen reporting that Israel's Pegasus software, the NSO group's Pegasus software, has been able to basically go into Signal as well, a backdoor for Signal. And of course, over the past 48 hours, if you didn't know what Signal was, you probably now do, with the scandal, the drama that's unfolded over the past few days with this quote unquote leaking of a chat for Yemen war plans, as the liberal media has liked to play it as war plans. So can you make sense of this? When you saw this story break, what were you looking at to say, yeah, this is real, or this is fake, this seems like it's a psyop, or this is just a big mistake here? What do you make of this Signal leak from Pete Hegseth, Mike Waltz, et cetera, to this Atlantic reporter, Jeffrey Goldberg?
Yeah, a few things. So first, on the Israeli link to being able to potentially penetrate Signal, I have no doubt about that at all. It would be the same with U.S. intelligence. I fully believe that Signal has been a U.S. military and intelligence front since virtually the day it was born. If you read, I think it was Yasha Labin's Surveillance Valley, has a whole section on the role of Signal in allowing foreign dissident groups to have secure communications when they're plotting to overthrow their governments with CIA support. This was something that's been championed by the U.S. intelligence community. If you remember, Catherine Marr was on the board of the Signal Foundation. Catherine Marr from the Atlantic Council, Catherine Marr, who was very active in the Arab Spring, Catherine Marr from the Council on Foreign Relations, Catherine Marr, who would then become the head of the Wikimedia Foundation, the governing board over Wikipedia, and all the scandals that broke with her promoting censorship under the rubric of promoting democracy. But the fact is that's a spook through and through with that resume, and she's on the board of Signal. You already have this sort of smoke billowing out of it from U.S. intelligence promotion of it. We wouldn't promote something to CIA-backed dissident groups unless we had back-end access to the messages being sent by CIA-backed dissident groups. That's just counterintelligence 101. Now, right. I do believe that in order to maintain that false front that Signal is secure, that the FBI and Justice Department do not pierce Signal messages in domestic prosecutions, which is to say that we saw this, for example, during January 6th. Whenever they use Signal messages, it would require them to have a confidential informant who actually went to an FBI field office and gave them their phone, and then they would download it off the phone. So I think that the reason Signal looks safe here in the U.S., if you're using it, is because if the FBI shows that it can breach Signal's encryption, then that becomes international news that, if basic law enforcement can, then that the NSA and CIA can. So that everybody else around the world is not able to. But I do believe that it's basically cracked and has been since the day it was born. But that there's still potential reasons to think that that's at the CIA, NSA level rather than at the FBI and local law enforcement level.
What about the question, I guess, really about well, is this a psyop? Did they actually leak this to Jeffrey Goldberg, or is this like a script? I mean, it seems, it smells fishy right from the beginning, but I want to hear your take.
I mean, I can't help but laugh at it. It's hard to know what to think of it, because I could see it going any direction. I could see it being a lapse. I could see it being a mole. I could see it being a prank. I think I saw someone's take on it on X earlier, that this would be like Jake Sullivan and Hillary Clinton adding Tucker Carlson to, a sensitive signal chat about, plans to topple to sidetrack the Brexit movement in the UK or something. It's just, it is a pretty astounding event, but I also don't know, what sort of damage actually resulted from it. There's, in the sense that my understanding is Goldberg sort of published it once the bombing actually happened. I don't know if I just don't know. I could see it going any way. The signal messages looked fairly anodyne, like a debate. I've seen people hypothesize that things that reportedly J.D. Vance said in those signal chat messages were intended to convey a message to Europe, and that maybe there was a hope that Jeffrey Goldberg would print that and sort of communicate the message. But, this is one of the strange mysteries of Trump world where, Trump himself has had these strange situations. If folks remember the John Barron episode where he would leak information about himself to the press while pretending to be someone else and saying that he is a tip about Donald Trump, but he's calling in with his own voice. And so, I've learned at this point not to question the mysterious ways of this unless there's something that, solid to chew on.
Yeah, I mean, it was strange. 24 hours before a congressional hearing on intelligence with Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel and all of them sitting there, like it just seemed very, very strange, the timing of all of this.
Also, the tone of his article bothers me a lot, because it's like, oops, I watched 12 civilians got bombed. I guess maybe I should have said, like, he doesn't have any contrition over whether he maybe could have published this and saved lives. It's just like, yeah, I watched it happen. Isn't that cool? I got a front row seat.
I'm just lurking here. Yeah, it just all smells like it.
It's tough on that front, I should say, because I do have sympathy for both sides of the argument in that case, even though I would consider myself very much at odds in general with the Atlantic and Jeffrey Goldberg. And I think that it's just a hodgepodge of rogue intelligence ops there with Ann Applebaum and David Frum in that network. But the fact is we have a very unclear state of the case law when it comes to publishing these sorts of things. We saw, Edward Snowden, obviously the high profile, attacks on him. I believe John Kiriakou, the former CIA agent, was prosecuted over. He made a public post about this, that he had been arrested for, for publishing information like this. And at the same time, if the CIA leaks it anonymously, if someone at the CIA leaks things anonymously to the New York Times, they can print that. And so there's a very strange situation. And this is something everything I do is open source. I try to never even put myself in a situation where I might have insider information that I need to worry about whether I might get arrested for publishing. But, the Pentagon Papers were leaked and published through that method. That was something that was heralded by the media community, and it was allowed by the Justice Department. But then, decades later, you now have the most, places like the Columbia Journalism Review and these media ethicist boards and our Justice Department itself now basically say that the Pentagon paper model is outdated and we should be prosecuting all this under the Espionage Act. So I don't envy the position of anyone who's a lurker in that group chat who sees something that they want to publish in order to save humanity, but fears that they may be prosecuted because the law is unclear in this space. I think the law is unclear in this space, and that's unfortunate.
Let's talk some bioweapons now, shall we?
Okay.
Yeah.
So recently you talked about COVID, anthrax, Lyme. You put these in the same category as things that the government might do to us, biological agents, which appear to be of natural origins. And putting Lyme disease in this category really caused a ruckus on X when people had not thought of this previously. They had accepted this as a natural phenomenon. So what can you tell us about Lyme disease as a biological weapon and how we can pull that thread?
And Montana and these labs and COVID in the United States. So all of it coming, I guess, out of Montana.
Yeah, I'd been interested in the Lyme disease story for some time. I've had family members who've had a pretty bad go of the Lyme story. And I read a few years ago a book by Chris Newby called Bitten, which left a pretty lasting impression on me. In this book, she documents the work of a scientist named Willy Bergdorfer, who is one of the world's preeminent biomedical researchers in Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases. And Bergdorfer was brought to the U.S. to work in the 1950s at Rocky Mountain Laboratories in Montana, which was the largest warehouse of ticks for biomedical research in the world. And these researchers at Rocky Mountain Labs were collecting ticks and fleas and mosquitoes and insects from the Rocky Mountains and then superjuicing them with various diseases, nominally for the purpose of creating a vaccine to, stop, to be able to create a cure for these diseases, so to speak, if anyone ever got them. But the fact is they were building a weapon, ostensibly, to build a defense against the weapon. But what happens if you don't really care about the defense about the weapon and you just want to build the weapon? Well, then saying you're building it to build the defense against it is the perfect cover for that. And the book lays out the military origins of all this work and the Pentagon funding and declassified documents over the years that showed the U.S. military intent. And they go over a single episode that they, during this of dropping tick-borne diseases into Cuba in order to cause a agricultural crop shortage because Cuba was under embargo and there was a naval blockade. They could not feed themselves without either importing from the United States, which they were not allowed to do. And so they had to grow their own crops. Well, they wanted to drive famine in order to overthrow Castro. This is the same strategy we have had for the past 10 years in Syria, burning the wheat fields, trying to cause famine in Syria in order to cause an uprising against Assad. And what you see in the JFK files that just came out is a direct confession from the senior military class of joint Pentagon and CIA approval to juice up tick-borne diseases and drop them using covert transport from the Navy, dropping them onto the sugarcane workers and agricultural mill workers in Cuba in order to cause agricultural sabotage. And they even took pains to say that they would use biological agents that would appear to be of natural origin, and claiming that they could blame this on local Cuban disaffection and potential complications from natural disasters, when they knew full well, because they were planning it would be biological agents of natural origin. But they also went on to say that intense pains had to be taken to make sure that any U.S. government connection to it was, quote, completely covered up. And lo and behold, you see the same thing happen with COVID, where you had these DARPA grants in 2018 at the Rocky Mountain Laboratory, the same place that's the star of the book Bitten, to super juice up coronavirus samples that they got from the Wuhan Institute of Virology in 2018, 1 year before COVID, directly to the same lab implicated in the creation of Lyme and these other tick-borne diseases that we now have a firsthand confession from the U.S. military to use to destabilize foreign countries. And, what's so interesting in these JFK files is they say that when they were going to drop the tick-borne bacteria on Cuba, they had to get the consent of one of the generals from the Navy who would be in charge of the transport and one of the individuals from the Central Intelligence Agency who was parked out of Fort Detrick, Maryland, in the lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland. So this is in the 1960s. This is 1962. The Fort Detrick lab in Maryland would later be revealed to be the source of the anthrax that was sent to members of Congress who refused to co-sign on the U.S. wars in the Middle East after 9/11. If you remember, there were almost a dozen members of Congress who were sent anthrax in the mail and vials of anthrax, and it was part of the reason that we got
Didn't like 3 people
approval.
die? 2 or 3 people died?
It was a huge scandal. Now, it would break out. Everyone, it was blamed at the time on Osama bin Laden and, the early Al-Qaeda networks. They were sending us anthrax while we were accusing them of having chemical weapons and biological weapons and weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Lo and behold, it turns out when they actually did the sample analysis on the anthrax, it was a strain that had only been created in Fort Detrick, Maryland, the exact same place that the JFK files said that they were using to super juice the tick-borne diseases to drop onto Cuba. Now, of course, when the Fort Detrick scandal with anthrax happened, that's when Bruce Ivins was blamed for smuggling it out. Now, nobody knows if that's true or false. The story seems ridiculous the moment you start looking into it. Bruce Ivins then later suicided himself, Epstein style, when charges were about to be brought on him, and dead men tell no tales. But you see a direct confession to the use of false flag attacks for biological warfare in the 1960s. You saw, that this very strange situation with anthrax. You saw the same thing with COVID. And it's not just the same playbook. It's the same players, the same labs, Rocky Mountain Labs in both cases, Fort Detrick in both places.
Yeah, in fact, I just looked at my notes as you were talking, and we reported that in August of 2019, there was a respiratory disease outbreak in and around Fort Detrick before we even knew about the COVID pandemic. Out of Fort Detrick, Maryland, it was in July, and the local news covered it and said, well, it's really strange to have a respiratory disease outbreak in July.
Yeah, we had a truck driver who worked at Fort Detrick told us that as well, that he also suffered from a respiratory illness going in and out of Fort Detrick. And then I think a number of service members there as well were hit with it. And
another data point, as you were speaking, I looked up the book Bitten by Chris Newby, and Goodreads does not want me to find it. So whenever that happens, Goodreads says, oh, no, you don't want this. You want some kind of fictional novel, right?
You want to read a Hillary Clinton biography.
Michelle Obama's book, right?
Just
then
read
you know you're on to something.
You'll be fine.
Exactly right. So whenever I get like that from Goodreads, I want that book. So thank you for that. I'm sure it will increase my anxiety about my
Well, they have a passage from there that's very similar. There's a passage in Bitten, and I read this out on a stream last night, but it goes through one of the people on the Air America flight depositing the ticks into Cuba, dropping the boxes of ticks, onto the Cuban agricultural workers. And, the firsthand or the testimony that's reported in that book is that that person ended up getting sick, just in the same way that it may be the case with what you're alleging about Fort Detrick, and that basically, there was a Hispanic person in the ward when that person's kid got an 105-degree fever, and the doctors couldn't figure out what the strange, set of symptoms, what was causing it. And, that person said that they had seen that, while working in Cuba and in the Caribbean. And that's when that person who had been a, covert under civilian cover had been, working for the CIA, dropping these boxes up, approached his sort of CIA next in command and asked if there was any connection between what had made his infant sick and what they had dropped over Cuba, and was instructed to burn everything, burn his clothes, and that the program had been discontinued.
Oh my gosh!
Oh my God! We'll get you out of here on this, Mike. You've been so gracious with your time. Is the Trump administration right now doing enough to provide transparency to the American people, or are there still like a number of blind spots that you hope will be revealed?
I think they're fighting like hell on it. I had moderate expectations and they've blown them away. There have been a huge number of sensitive things that were disclosed in the JFK files that had been redacted, even through the 2017 declassification, when Trump 1 declassified some of the JFK files. Some of those, I think there was a perception that the world couldn't handle it if it was fully redacted. And I think there's been a very mature response in whole on those things. I think that it's going to be tougher with the Epstein files. There's still a lot of attention. They've now set the gold standard, right? With these JFK files. I mean, there was no redactions on them. I was making this comment earlier that we can actually use these to reconstruct a fair amount of American statecraft from the 20th century, because so many foundations have been effectively doxed as CIA fronts. So many points of contact, so many institutions and civil society organizations have now been unbracketed. They are now unredacted. And you can see why they remained redacted through 2017, because these institutions are alive and well today, whether that's the AFL-CIO or whether that is the World Confederation for Organizations of the Teaching Profession, which is now Education International, or whether these are relations with foreign intelligence services, whether that's Israel or Australia or Mexico City or any of the others that have just been declassified. You can see how every one of these might not want that information public. But the Trump administration said, damn the torpedoes, here's our dirty underwear. And I respect that intensely. The question is it's one thing to do that about an event that happened 63 years ago. It's another thing to have that happen with something 63 months ago with the Epstein network, right? I mean, this is the 2019 event. This is not 1962. The people involved in the Epstein story are alive and well. And when you talk about those sensitivities, I would have to imagine that the forces within the national security community, the same ones who waved off Alex Acosta, Epstein's prosecutor, because he was told to back off because Epstein belonged to intelligence. I have to imagine that the pressure to not do the same thing with Epstein that was done with JFK is immense, and there's probably a knife fight in the toll booth of the National Security Council right now about how much to disclose. I think that what Trump wants and what he will get, we don't know how they'll square that circle yet.
Yeah, and I was just talking with Tucker Carlson on his show the other day about the USS Liberty. I mean, they're veterans who are begging Pete Hegseth for transparency, just to hold an investigation, an open door investigation. I mean, and so victims of 9/11, the families want answers. So there's a lot of stuff that you're right is fresh. We don't have to go back to 63 years ago, and we'll see what the Trump administration will do on some of those bigger issues. But I'm excited, certainly on some of these big files. Yeah. I am curious, though, on the UFO piece of the JFK files. Like, when are we going to see pieces of that? If there any UFO-related information on the JFK files, what do you think about that?
And Marco Rubio was a big proponent of that. That was one of his main talking points, and he's a senior administration official.
Yeah.
Well, I've seen too many documents on the UFO story from the 1950s and 60s that almost presuppose a CIA role in using UFO stories to mislead people. That, I mean, there's the famous case, I think it was 1954 in Guatemala, when there was a coup. I think there was a State Department cable to the CIA station that warned that the local government had caught on to a CIA coup in Guatemala, and that the CIA station was instructed effectively to use its propaganda Wisner's Wurlitzer media network to drum up stories, I believe they said, about flying saucers and mothers with octuplets in order to distract, I believe it was the Guatemalan population, away from coverage by the government's radio of the disclosure of the blown CIA activity. And when you see CIA instructions to print stories about UFOs in order to bury eyeballs from their own malfeasance, and then you see, if you've seen the movie Mirage Men,
yeah,
and just the lengths to which the UFO story is blown up
useful?
in order to, useful in order to do operational security, to do counterintelligence, in that story, they get, a guy who's living right next to an Air Force base in, I believe it was New Mexico or Nevada, who is a technician and a competent technological researcher who's living next to the Air Force base and sees these highly classified aircraft and begins investigating and talking about it. And so the Air Force base runs a psyop on him, convinces him, his life becomes a Truman Show, as every new person he meets is working for the NSA, the CIA, or Air Force counterintelligence. And then they convince him that what he's seen are, unidentified flying objects, and it must be aliens. They break into his house while he's not home, and they rig his computer to emit strange messages. And you see that, and you go, okay, all right, there's clearly a lot more going on here than just allegations of intelligent life. There's clearly intelligence operations here rather than intelligent life.
For sure.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they get to paint you as a conspiracy nut and a wacko, and then they can distract you over here with that story while they're pulling off something over here.
Well, Mike Benz, we've long wanted to speak with you. We're so grateful for your time. You can find Mike Benz at Mike Benz Cyber on X. Also, he runs the Foundation for Freedom Online. You can find that at foundationforfreedomonline.com. Do you object to being called a wonk? I think that's maybe one of my favorite, the best ways to describe you, because every time that you follow him on X, you're going to learn something and learn how deep the roots go of a lot.
I would love to see it at like a local library, like story time for the kids with Mike Benz. Yeah. Can you imagine?
That's right. Children's books. We'll do children's books online to see how that.
And kids, then they brought the ticks in, children.
Yes, kids, get ready. Have your mind blown. Mommy, I don't know if I want to go back to that children's hour again with Mike Benz. Mike, great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate your wonkiness on all of these topics, and we need people like you who are shining a light on this. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks. Talk to you.
So amazing. Thanks, Mike. Right.